The scariest thing at work isn't getting fired. It's when the company wants you to quit on your own. Because when that happens, no one tells you what's really going on. No one warns you. No one sits you down and says your position is at risk. But if the signs we're about to talk about start showing up all at once, there's a good chance the company is hoping you'll eventually walk out that door yourself. The problem is that most people don't recognize it. They think they need to work harder, take on more responsibilities, be more patient, prove themselves even more. Meanwhile, important opportunities slowly disappear. Their name stops coming up in key conversations, and the people who once supported them begin to grow distant. By the time they realize what's actually happening, they've often spent months fighting for a position the company no longer intends to keep. Melissa used to believe that if a company no longer wanted an employee, they would simply say it directly. That sounds reasonable. But after years in the corporate world, she realized reality often works very differently. What people see is an employee receiving poor evaluations, being placed on a PIP, or eventually deciding to resign. What they don't see is everything that happened beforehand. In some cases, the decision was made long before anyone else knew about it. Everything that follows is simply the process of making that decision look justified on paper. That's why so many people feel blindsided when it finally happens. But the truth is, it rarely happens overnight. They're only seeing the last chapter of the story. If you're watching this video, you may be trying to answer a question yourself. Are you simply going through a difficult phase at work? Or are these signs that your company is quietly preparing for your departure? No one can draw a conclusion from a single incident, but there are certain patterns that show up again and again in stories like these. Melissa has seen them. Many employees have seen them too. And the first sign usually appears in a place most people never think to look: your inbox. Sign number 1, everything suddenly starts getting documented. Melissa remembers exactly when she first felt that something was changing. Not because of an argument, not because of a major mistake, but because of the emails. In the past, if a small issue came up, her manager would simply stop by her desk. They'd talk for a few minutes, and that would be the end of it. But one day, after what felt like a completely normal conversation, an email appeared in her inbox. The message was polite. It simply summarized what had just been discussed. Melissa didn't think much of it. But then it happened again and again. Not once, not twice. Over time, almost every piece of feedback started being followed up in writing. Things that used to be handled through a quick conversation suddenly left a paper trail. What caught Melissa's attention wasn't the content of the emails. It was the change in how everything was being documented. Many professional organizations keep records of conversations and decisions. That's completely normal. But when the amount of documentation suddenly increases, especially when the change seems to apply only to you, it's worth paying closer attention. One thing many employees don't realize is that before an organization takes action against someone, it usually wants documentation. Not feelings, not memories, evidence. That's why Melissa stopped reacting emotionally. She didn't send frustrated emails. She didn't try to argue when she felt disappointed. Instead, she started keeping records of the things that reflected the true value of her work. Thank you messages from clients, successful projects, results that exceeded expectations. If someone else is documenting a story about you, make sure you have your own version of the truth as well. Because when the time comes to look at the full picture, you don't want the story to be told from only one side. But documentation is often just the beginning. What happens next is what truly makes many employees nervous. One day, you're invited to a meeting, and for the first time, you hear 3 letters that most office workers never want to hear. PIP. SI number 2. A PIP isn't always a second chance. Melissa still remembers how she felt when she received the invitation to that meeting. The meeting title sounded completely normal. Nothing seemed unusual. But only a few minutes after sitting down, she heard a term that almost every office employee has heard at some point. PIP. Performance Improvement Plan. At first, Melissa tried to stay positive. She told herself this might be an opportunity to prove her value, that if she improved a little more, everything would go back to normal. But as she carefully reviewed the document, she started noticing things that made her uneasy. Some of the goals felt vague, several expectations were difficult to measure, and a few requirements left her wondering what success would even look like. That's when Melissa realized something important. A genuine improvement plan gives you a clear path forward. It helps you understand where you are, where you need to go, and what you must do to get there. But when goals constantly shift or remain unclear, people often end up feeling like they can never do enough. That's one reason so many employees become exhausted during this stage. They work harder than ever, yet feel less secure than ever. Instead of panicking, Melissa changed her approach. After every meeting, she sent a follow-up email summarizing what had been discussed. If a goal wasn't clear, she asked for clarification in writing. If expectations changed, she documented it. When things become vague, clarity becomes one of the strongest forms of protection you have. But eventually, Melissa noticed something else. Even though she was still doing her job every day, her presence inside the organization seemed to be slowly fading in a much more subtle way. Sign number 3, you start disappearing from important conversations. At first, it was just one meeting. Melissa assumed someone had simply forgotten to send the invitation. That happens. It didn't seem like a big deal. But a few weeks later, another meeting took place without her. This time, it involved a project she had always been part of. Then there was an important email she no longer received. Then a decision that directly affected her work was made before she even knew it was being discussed. No one ever said Melissa was no longer important. No one officially removed her from the team. But the feeling of being left out became harder and harder to ignore. This is one of the most difficult signs of quiet firing to recognize, because it doesn't create a single dramatic moment that demands a reaction. It happens gradually, little by little, until one day you look back and realize you're no longer included in places where you once had a seat. Melissa spent a long time wondering if she was overthinking it, but eventually she realized the issue wasn't any one meeting. It was the pattern. If an organization is trying to reduce its dependence on an employee, one of the first things it often does is gradually reduce that person's influence. Less information, less involvement, fewer opportunities to contribute. Because once the system becomes comfortable operating without you, your departure becomes much easier to manage. Instead of reacting emotionally, Melissa started observing. She stopped focusing on individual incidents. She focused on the bigger picture. And that's when she realized the problem wasn't limited to meetings. Even her day-to-day work was beginning to change in ways that felt strangely unfamiliar. If you've ever been left out of a meeting that you used to attend regularly, leave the word seen. Sometimes realizing that you're not the only person who has gone through this can make the situation a little easier to understand. Essay number 4, your work no longer looks the same. Melissa used to believe that changes in workload were completely normal, and most of the time they are. No project lasts forever. No client stays forever. But what caught her attention wasn't the fact that things were changing, it was the direction of the change. First, a major client was reassigned to someone else. Then, a high-profile project she had spent months working toward was given away. Then came another growth opportunity that she had once assumed she would be involved in. Each time, there was a reasonable explanation. Each time, it sounded temporary. But when Melissa looked back, she noticed a pattern. The work that created visibility and influence was slowly disappearing from her desk. Interestingly, in some companies, the opposite happens. Instead of having responsibilities taken away, an employee suddenly receives assignments that are almost impossible to complete. Shorter deadlines, fewer resources, higher expectations. Either way, the outcome is often the same. That employee gradually loses their position within the organization. That's when Melissa stopped focusing only on the amount of work she was receiving and started paying attention to the quality of the opportunities being assigned to her. Because sometimes the warning sign isn't that you have too much work. It's that the work capable of advancing your career is no longer coming your way. And what ultimately changed Melissa's perspective wasn't a project or a client. It was the person who had once guided her career. Sign number 5, your manager suddenly feels like a different person. One thing Melissa learned after years in the workplace is this. You can often tell a lot about your position in an organization by how your manager chooses to spend their 5, time with you. In the past, Melissa's conversations with her manager were usually focused on the future. Skills she could develop, new opportunities she could pursue, upcoming projects she might lead. They were the kinds of conversations that made an employee feel like they were moving forward. Then things gradually changed. One-on-one meetings became shorter. conversations became more distant. Questions about career growth disappeared. Instead, the focus shifted toward closer monitoring, smaller processes, smaller details, smaller mistakes. Melissa couldn't understand what had changed until she realized something simple. Good managers usually invest their time in people they believe have a future within the organization. They coach, they mentor, they create opportunities. When that investment disappears entirely, it's a signal worth paying attention to. That doesn't mean every busy manager is trying to push you out. But if this change appears alongside several of the other signs we've discussed today, it deserves a closer look. Melissa stopped trying to win back someone else's approval. Instead, she focused on observing actions, because actions are often more honest than words. And then someone new started showing up in meetings, someone who had never been there before. HR. Sign number 6. HR shows up and your career stops moving forward. The first time HR joined a one-on-one meeting with her manager, Melissa, felt a little surprised. She told herself she was probably overthinking it. But then she noticed other changes happening at the same time. Salary discussions quietly disappeared. Promotion opportunities kept getting postponed. Conversations about her future within the company gradually faded away. There wasn't one major event. There wasn't an official announcement. It just felt like several doors were closing at the same time. That was when Melissa stepped back and looked at everything that had happened over the previous months. The emails, the PIP, the meetings she was no longer invited to, the projects that disappeared, the change in her manager's behavior, and now HR sitting in the room. Any one of those signs alone might not mean much. But when she put them together, the picture became much clearer. That was also the moment Melissa stopped hoping that everything would somehow return to the way it used to be. Not because she was pessimistic, but because she wanted to face reality. Because when you recognize the truth early enough, you still have time to prepare for what comes next. And that may be the most important lesson in this entire story. It's not about controlling the company's decision. It's about making sure you don't lose control of your own future. Because a single sign doesn't necessarily mean anything. But when several signs begin appearing together, they often form a much clearer pattern. Melissa eventually realized something important. Sometimes the problem isn't your performance. Sometimes the organization made its decision long before you knew it. So if you recognize several of the signs from today's video, don't panic. Observe. Pay attention to what's happening around you. And start creating more options for yourself. Because when you have options, you make decisions from a place of clarity rather than fear. And that's what truly protects your career. It took Melissa years to realize that maturity at work isn't about staying at any cost. It's about knowing when it's time to prepare for a better chapter. Because your value is not determined by one manager. And it's certainly not determined by one company. If today's video reminded you of an experience you've been through, share it in the comments. Your story might help someone else realize that what they're experiencing is more common than they think. And if you'd like to keep exploring the hidden realities of corporate life, workplace psychology, and practical strategies for protecting your career, be sure to like this video and subscribe to You and Me at Work. Thank you for spending your time with us today. And wherever you are in your career right now, I hope you recognize your own value sooner than Melissa did.